Some footballers lost form. These 10 lost their freedom. From icons to ruined talents, here are 10 footballers who actually ended up behind bars for real. At number 10, Jermain Pennant. He was one of those English wingers who always looked like he had more in him. Fast, direct, technically sharp, and good enough to play for Arsenal, Liverpool, and a long list of other clubs. But before he ever became the finished player people expected, his name was already tied to trouble. In 2005, Pennant was sent to prison for 3 months after drink driving while banned from the road and without insurance. For a young player with real top-level potential, that was a brutal way to stop momentum. What keeps Pennant on this list is not just the sentence, it is what that moment came to represent. This was not a fading veteran at the end of the line. This was still a player who could have built a much cleaner, bigger career. He did recover enough to play in the Premier League again, and that matters. But the prison spell stayed attached to his name the whole time. With all due respect to some of the names below him in terms of pure wrongdoing, Pennant makes this ranking because he is one of the clearest examples of early talent colliding with bad decisions. A wasted chance, more than anything. At number 9, Lee Hughes. Unlike Pennant, this story is remembered less for broken promise and more for tragedy. Hughes was a proven goal scorer in English football, especially for West Brom, and he had built the kind of reputation that usually keeps a striker well respected long after retirement. But in 2004, everything changed. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison for causing death by dangerous driving after a crash that killed Douglas Graham. The case became even more damaging because Hughes left the scene and only handed himself in much later. That detail is the one people never forgot. Footballers have had road incidents before, but walking away from a fatal crash turned this into something far darker in the public eye. Hughes did eventually return to football after serving part of the sentence, which shows how complicated these stories can be. But the comeback never erased the case. Compared with Pennant, this was not just reckless. It ended in a death, and that is why it lands higher. However many goals he scored after that, his legacy was permanently split in two. That is the real weight of this one. At number 8, René Higuita. On pure football personality alone, he might be the most unforgettable goalkeeper on this list. The scorpion kick, the risks on the ball, the wild confidence, Higuita never looked like a normal keeper. But in 1993, he was jailed in Colombia after acting as an intermediary in a kidnapping case. He handled ransom money and accepted payment for helping, which under Colombian law put him in serious trouble. He spent 7 months in prison without trial, and for a player who was also a national icon, the damage was huge. The part that really changes his football story is what came next. Because of that prison spell, Higuita missed the 1994 World Cup with Colombia, and that is a massive twist in his career. This was a keeper who symbolized the swagger of Colombian football, and suddenly he was out of the biggest tournament of all. Compared with some of the English names below him, Higuita's case sits in a different world, tied to the chaos of Colombia in that era. Still, prison removed him from the game at a huge moment. That alone puts him firmly in this ranking. At number 7, Duncan Ferguson. Even by old-school British football standards, Ferguson had a reputation for being hard, fierce, and completely unpredictable. But what makes his case stand out is that his prison sentence came from something that happened on the pitch. In 1995, while playing for Rangers, he was sentenced to 3 months for headbutting Wraith Rovers player Jock McStay during a match. That is almost unheard of in top-level football. Suspensions are common. Police involvement over an in-game incident is already rare. Actual prison time is another level entirely. That is why Ferguson ranks this high. This was not some late-night story away from football. The violence happened in the game itself, in front of everyone, and it turned a football foul into a criminal case. The court also looked at his previous record, which made things worse for him. He later rebuilt his image as a cult hero, especially with Everton fans, but the prison spell never left the story. Compared with Barton, who comes next, Ferguson's case is more unusual because it came straight from football action. That makes it one of the strangest prison stories the game has seen. At number 6, Joey Barton. Barton was a Premier League footballer who always felt one argument away from another headline, and in 2008, the worst version of that reputation caught up with him. While a Newcastle player, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison after admitting assault and affray over a violent incident in Liverpool city centre. CCTV footage made the case even uglier. This was not a little scuffle blown out of proportion. The court saw a serious attack, and Barton's name was already linked with disciplinary issues before this happened. Prison did not create his image. It confirmed it. What really pushed Barton up this ranking is the feeling that nobody was shocked it had got this far. That sounds harsh, but it is true. With Ferguson, the prison story is shocking because it came from a match. With Barton, it fit a pattern of anger and lack of control that followed him through much of his career. He served 74 days before release, returned to football, and kept the story moving, but the sentence became one of the first things people mention when they talk about him. For a player with real quality in midfield, that says everything. The football was never enough to outrun the chaos. At number 5, Adam Johnson. This is one of the bleakest cases on the list because he was still in his playing years when everything collapsed. Johnson had played for Middlesbrough, Manchester City, Sunderland, and England. And even if he had not fully hit the level some expected, he was still a recognizable top-flight footballer. Then, in 2016, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for sexual activity with a 15-year-old girl and grooming. The court made clear that he knew her age. Once that conviction landed, his career did not just dip, it effectively ended. What makes Johnson rank this high is how complete the downfall was. Some players return from prison to lower leagues, rebuild their image a little, or at least keep part of their football identity. Johnson lost almost all of it. Sunderland cut ties, his name became toxic in the game, and whatever football future he still had disappeared overnight. Compared with Barton or Pennant, this was not a story about immaturity or temper. This was a serious criminal conviction that destroyed the rest of his playing life. He is on this list because prison did not interrupt his career. It erased it. At number 4, Tony Adams. This one hits differently because Adams is not remembered as a sideshow figure. He is one of the biggest names in English football, a legendary Arsenal captain, and a player who led by presence as much as ability. In 1990, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison for drink driving after crashing his car while heavily intoxicated. He later served around 58 days before release. At the time, that was a huge story. This was not some fringe player messing up. It was the captain of Arsenal and a major face of English football. What pushes Adams above a lot of the others is the way prison became part of a much bigger life story. Years later, he spoke openly about alcoholism, got sober, and turned himself into one of football's strongest voices on addiction and recovery. That does not erase what happened, but it changes the shape of the story. Compared with Johnson or Barton, Adams has a genuine redemption arc attached to his fall. And because he was such a major football figure, the shock was bigger too. Prison could have defined him completely. Instead, it became the darkest chapter before a real rebuild. At number 3, Bruno Fernandes de Souza, better known simply as Bruno. For Brazilian football fans, this case was horrifying because Bruno was not just another goalkeeper. He was seen as one of the most promising keepers in the country and a player who could have had an even bigger future ahead of him. Instead, in 2013, the former Flamengo goalkeeper was sentenced to 22 years and 3 months in prison for his role in the murder of his former partner, Elisa Samudio. At that point, this was no longer a story about scandal around a footballer. It was a criminal case of the most serious kind. That is why Bruno sits this high. The sentence was massive, the crime was horrific, and the collapse of his career was absolute. Brazil followed the case intensely because of how famous he was becoming, and every development made the story darker. There were later legal twists and even attempts to return to football, which only made the public reaction even stronger. Compared with Adams or Best, this is not a story of addiction and self-destruction. It is far more severe than that. Bruno is here because few prison stories in football are as disturbing, as public, or as career-destroying as this one. At number 2, George Best. This is where the list becomes much bigger than the sentence itself. Best was one of the greatest football talents Britain ever produced, a Manchester United legend, a Ballon d'Or winner, and a player whose style made him famous far beyond the pitch. But by 1984, the fall had become painfully public. He was sentenced to 12 weeks in prison for drink driving, assaulting a police officer, and failing to appear in court. He served around 2 months. For a man once treated like football royalty, the image of prison told you exactly how far things had gone. What makes Best almost impossible to place anywhere else is the contrast. This was not a minor star or a cult hero. This was George Best, and his prison spell became one of the clearest symbols of genius being eaten away by addiction. Everyone knew his battle with alcohol was getting worse, but prison made the decline impossible to romanticize. With all due respect to Adams, who also turned a prison story into part of a recovery arc, Best's peak was even higher, and the fall felt even sadder. He remains one of football's greatest talents, but prison is part of that story forever. At number 1, Ronaldinho. And honestly, no name on this list hits harder. We are talking about a World Cup winner, a Ballon d'Or winner, one of the most entertaining footballers the sport has ever seen, and a player whose smile was part of his global image. Then in March 2020, Ronaldinho and his brother entered Paraguay using false Paraguayan documents. What followed was one of the strangest football scandals of modern times. The court kept him in custody, and suddenly one of the most famous footballers on the planet was sitting in jail in Asunción. It felt unreal because of who he was. That is exactly why he takes number 1. Some cases on this list are darker, some sentences were longer. But nobody here matches Ronaldinho for worldwide fame and shock value. He spent around a month in prison before being moved to house arrest in a hotel, and the whole story became a global media circus. Some people believed he was being used by others. Others said there was no way he could not know something was wrong. Either way, the image stuck. When a football icon that big ends up behind bars, even briefly, it becomes one of the most unforgettable off-field stories the game has ever seen. No one tops that for pure disbelief. This list proves football fame protects nobody. Different eras, different crimes, same result. Once prison enters your story, it can follow you longer than almost any goal ever will. Who do you think should be higher, lower, or not on this list at all? And is there another footballer we missed? Drop your picks in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more football rankings.